What are Yukio Mishima's best novels? Well, today I'm going to be ranking most of them. And if you don't already know, Right Conscious is the headquarters of everything related to Mishima here on YouTube. In the playlist down below, you will find over 10 videos on Mishima's books, life, and his philosophy. And that playlist is going to continue to grow every single week. And unlike many other YouTubers who like to obsess over Sun and Steel and Mishima's life, we talk about what made Mishima great, his greatest contribution to the world, and that is his novels. His novels are criminally underread and not talked about. And of course, that's because there is a section of people who outright reject Mishima because of his politics and the couple paragraphs of Wikipedia they read about him. Like, oh my God, I can't support this guy, or this guy can't write good fiction. And then there is another group of bros who just don't read fiction in general and can't connect to Mishima's more sentimental side. And so I'm getting pumped for this. Let's hop into it. So these rankings are always hard because I always say, who are we ranking this against? Are we ranking his novels in terms of the best to worst? Or are we ranking their impact on Japanese culture and culture in general? Or are we ranking them in terms of the literary canon at large? Or ranking them, against the books of his time? And in today's video, I'm going to be ranking them against the great works, what I consider the best literature in the world. And so some of these novels may end up a little bit low because they're being compared to some really good stuff. So first on the list, we have Spring Snow, and we'll zoom in here, which is Yukio Mishima's first book in his Sea of Fertility tetralogy. So the Sea of Fertility tetralogy is the series he started right before he decided that he was going to kill himself and become an aesthetic terrorist. And just FYI for all the new listeners or people who haven't got too deep into Mishima, one of the big myths around Mishima that has been pushed, I think, out of ignorance and by people who are scared of his politics is that Yukio Mishima tried to stage a coup and overthrow the government. But in actuality, he knew that it was going to fail. He told everyone that he went with that don't do anything stupid, don't get yourself in trouble, you will be fine. If he actually thought it was going to work, he would tell them we are going to go all the way. Mishima knew that getting up on a balcony and speaking to a bunch of random people in the army about restoring the emperor wasn't going to work. It's that simple. What he did was an aesthetic suicide. His whole life was about these aesthetics and these statements, and he was carefully crafting his persona. And so, of course, he wanted to craft his death. He wanted to have people like me talk about it. But over time, because in the West, we have our, oh my God, we have to call the suicide hotline, and our mantras, he took the easy way out. I don't have to talk about anyone, or I don't have to listen to anyone or take advice from anyone who killed themselves. That means they failed at life. When we have these very ignorant conceptions about suicide from people who live their life with no meaning and do nothing and die in some hospital around family members that are thinking about what's for dinner and the pain in their back, then it's all kind of silly. But I just wanted to say that. So the Sea of Fertility tetralogy is his kind of last great pieces of work. And it's somewhat interesting because the first novel, Spring Snow, is about the aristocracy. It's about, and I'm going to place this at an A, just so I don't have to hold it. Spring Snow, and I'm not going to spoil anything, is about three different characters. The main one being Kyoki, who is a part of a family who is rising the ranks in nobility and in prominence in Japanese society. There are two other characters, one named Honda, whose family is in law, and then another named Satoko, who is a love interest whose family is somewhat on the decline. This novel is a beautiful exploration of Japan and the influence of the West on Japan. It also opens up the main theme of the novel, which is reincarnation and kind of this spiritual yearning. This novel has some of the best descriptions of Japan that you will find anywhere. The writing in Spring Snow is absolutely beautiful, you guys. Like, you will read this and your breath will be taken away. You will want to go to Japan. The writing in this alone catapults it to an A. And like I said, an A is contending with some of the best works of all time. I think that everyone should at least everyone should read the Sea of Fertility tetralogy in general, and Spring Snow is a pretty good place to start with Mishima. It's dense, it's long, it introduces characters and ideas that you are going to remember forever. And so I put this one pretty high in terms of Mishima's novels and recommend it to everyone. Next on the list, we have The Temple of the Golden Pavilion, which tells the story of a Buddhist acolyte named Mizoguchi, and this is based off of a real story. And if any of you guys have not seen the movie Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters, then you need to see that immediately, because The Temple of the Golden Pavilion is included in that and brought to life by Paul Schrader. It is the best movie ever made about an author and their works ever. It's the best blend of a biopic and an author's work that I've ever seen. It's one of the better films of the 20th century, and everybody needs to see it. So I'm going to take a jump here, and I'm going to throw The Temple of the Golden Pavilion up here in the S tier. I think that Mizoguchi's obsession with beauty shows the dark side of aesthetics. I don't think any other novel ever created, or I could say any other piece of art, shows how aesthetic ideals and connecting aesthetics to a signifier or a transcendent quality can actually fragment you further. And so this novel, as I just was saying, is based on true events. And it follows this Buddhist acolyte named Mizoguchi, who is obsessed with this Temple of the Golden Pavilion, this Buddhist temple in Japan. And all throughout his early life, he was told about how beautiful this temple is. And eventually he gets to go and serve there. And it's written from a first-person point of view, and it is a Proustian and Dostoevskian classic. And the same with Spring Snow. I should say that about both of these novels, that I think that these two, especially Spring Snow and Temple of the Golden Pavilion, is some of the best examples of really interior, prophetic voice monologues done by a Japanese author, akin to what was happening with Dostoevsky and Proust and even Tolstoy in some of his works, and many other of the classic authors that we love in the West. And so as the novel progresses, and almost from the start, instead of being uplifted by this transcendent temple, Mizoguchi feels constrained by it, trampled by it. And we're in his head, and the way that he writes about this temple is some of the more beautiful writing that I've ever experienced. It's some of the more in-detail writing, and really kind of gets to this idea of dharana, or pure sight, that is talked about in Buddhism and yoga, and is a big deal in Eastern philosophy. Because as Rilke said in his Duino Elegies, which is one of the greatest poetry collections of all time, that if we saw angels for what they really were, we'd be terrified and we'd end up dying. That, this is like akin to end of the Alien Indiana Jones movie where the girl gets too much knowledge and she's like, stop, please. If we actually saw reality for what it was with full clarity, with none of our biases, we couldn't handle it. And Mizoguchi in this is doing that. And how Mishima sets this up, and like I said, I'm not going to spoil anything big. There's like a lot of events that happen, but Mizoguchi is a stutterer. He has this really bad stutter, and that kind of puts him in the silent world, in the world of observation. He cannot obviously get women or be this seducer or be this powerful individual. He's somewhat clumsy. And so he becomes basically this alienated nihilist. And if you are interested, for instance, in his book, Sun and Steel, and you're interested in Mishima's aesthetics and bodybuilding, this is the one that you should read. This is a beautiful example of what happens when you take that too far. Not to say that you are. This guy is obviously mentally ill, like many characters in these novels that we're going to be talking about. But another thing that I really like about this novel is Mishima inverts Zen Buddhism, because Mishima knew that Buddhism was a transplant into Japan, that it was unnatural, that it replaced Shintoism and other things and other pagan cultures, and actually made the Japanese people more, one could say, passive. This is actually a big thing about Christianity also, that, Buddhism and many of these religions helped keep the population down, because within them there was this peaceful, forgiving nature, which in the long run was a good thing, because it helped us kind of move up into the heart chakra, or, into higher consciousness, and get over a lot of our primal instincts. But for many cultures and civilizations throughout time, people were under tyranny because of these ideals, because of this more passive New Testament or Buddhist Zen philosophy. And so Misoguchi isn't getting a lot of the, he's taking a lot of the, and this is actually very akin to what is happening in the West and has been happening for decades. Misoguchi takes the detachment aspect of Zen, kind of the more personal power aspects of Zen, and uses those, like all the dudes in Silicon Valley. I meditate, but you make fucking software that's spyware and work for the government and build these, all this crazy stuff that is negative for society, but with a clean conscience because you meditate and, have this kind of Zen philosophy. But Misoguchi is the same way. There's a master there that's trying to help him. People all around him are trying to help him with koans and all this cool stuff. And it's just going over his head. It's like Kashua Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day, which is also another great novel by a Japanese author. First person, unreliable narrator. And so finally, this novel is about aesthetic action, about beauty in action. And I would say that The Temple of the Golden Pavilion is, as a whole, the best primer on Mishima's philosophy of everything. Like, there are books that are more autobiographical or get into cooler stuff, I could say, like Runaway Horses, like Politics, Revolution, Reincarnation, which we'll talk about in a second. But this one will let you know what Mishima is all about. And Mishima later in his life, and this was a trend, people look at this and they laugh, but we don't laugh at the Black Panthers or some of the crazy radical black groups that, and other groups, the PLO over in the Middle East and other people that were going crazy in the 60s and 70s, killing people and taking revolutionary action. It was kind of a big thing, and we felt, the culture at that time felt the corporations, big government, kind of cracking down, and they knew that the old world was finally fading away, and many of them felt like this aesthetic, terrorist, violent kind of action was the only way to wake people up and kind of draw us back into something better, into a fascist, communist, or whatever utopia that they were trying to push. And it's important for us to contemplate this because, of course, I'm not advocating for you to go take violent actions, but we've been neutered in our society. We are a bunch of pansies now. I know people who have experienced violations which they feel are immoral, and they just take it, pardon my French, up the ass because they know that we are locked down in our society and there is no way that you can rebel or make any change against Big Brother, even though there is, if we did as a collective, if we actually pulled it together. And unfortunately, violence does speak, and when done in mass can create action. A lot of the time, it does lead to putting the wrong people in power, because the type of people who will create a revolution aren't the people you want leading the new government, because they are tyrants and the more ego action-oriented type of people, not the philosophers or the thinkers. And so, as I was saying earlier, this novel is based on the life of Hayashi Yoken, I think his name is. I probably got that wrong. I'm going to mess up some of the Japanese names in this. I'm sorry for all the pronunciation nerds out there. But we only know about Hayashi's kind of motives and what he did, which is very similar to this novel, like the actions. But we don't know the psychology, and Mishima really fills in the psychology here. And this is another example of an author like Cormac McCarthy with Blood Meridian or Shakespeare not having to worry about the plot. Like, the story's already there. We know where this guy's from. We know what he ends up doing, but filling in the details. And when you have that, you can really just focus on that and really be a maximalist. And I really feel like that's what's happening with this. This and Spring Snow, I would say, are Mishima's more maximal novels. And I'm a big supporter of maximalism. And yeah, I'm excited for you guys to read this, and yeah, go ahead. I mean, this one is highly recommended by me, and once again is included in the Mishima movie. And so next on our list, we have Confessions of a Mask, which is one of Mishima's more read novels. And actually, now that we're talking about it, this week in the Right Conscious Book Club, which is the most active book club in the world, we read 8 to 10 books a month, and we are working our way through Mishima's bibliography right now. This Saturday, 9 a.m. Pacific time, we are reading Confessions of a Mask. I would love for you guys to be there. You will be interested, if you are interested in Mishima, in many of the other books we are reading. We have probably read 6 or 7 Mishima novels already, and we are continuing through them. I record all the book club calls, and so you guys can watch some of those. This month, we are also reading Mao 2, The Gambler by Dostoevsky, Bleeding Edge by Pynchon, Blood Meridian by McCarthy, a Nabokov novel. We read transformative literature over here, and you also will get access to all of my courses, the Cormac McCarthy course, David Foster Wallace course, and I'm going to put a link down below. I would love to see you guys over here. I also have a ton of free content. I have a bunch of my writing on here for free. There are dozens of podcasts and videos that go into taboo topics or meta topics that I can't cover here on YouTube. And so if you are interested in that and want to support me and my dream of becoming a full-time English teacher online and helping kickstart the literary renaissance, I would love to see you guys over there. But let us hop back to my ranking of Confessions of a Mask. And I'm going to put Confessions of a Mask up here in the A category. And that's because if you want to dive into Mishima and understand some of his more taboo sides or his sexuality or his childhood, this is the best place to start. And this is what really blew him up in America and made him a pretty well-read author over here. But it is a style and has a sense of sentimentality that he doesn't necessarily dive into as much later on in his career, because that's something interesting about authors, is that a lot of the time as they progress, they become more hollow or more interested in various topics or in death or many of these things, like Cormac McCarthy, Thomas Pynchon, Mishima. At the end of their life, their books take a more serious or odd tone. And so if you go back to their earlier work, you see more purple prose, you see more language and relationships and reflections on childhood and many of these different things, because you're closer to it. You know, by the time you're 80 years old, it was 70 years since you were a child. But when you're 28 years old, it was only 15 years ago. And so Mishima wrote this at 24. And what's interesting is Mishima had that cold, detached style that we somewhat like him for in some of his other works, but he still has that sprouting beauty that later in his works, like in The Temple of the Golden Pavilion or in The Sea of Tetralogy, would be projected outward onto revolution or religion or some of these other things. But in Confessions of a Mask, it's more turned inward. I really like this because it also explores some of Mishima's early thoughts on fascism, the post-World War world. You know, this Mishima wasn't very far removed when he wrote this from the time it was set in 1949. Surprisingly enough, as we continue to talk about some of these novels, even though directly after the war was a really crucial time for Japan and obviously something that is easy to write about, Mishima didn't explore it as much as you think he would. For instance, The Temple of the Golden Pavilion has a lot of content that takes place after the war, but it really doesn't explore too much of the intimate details. There's just some kind of outward symbols. But Confessions of a Mask more sits in the culture and what's going on. The Sea of Fertility tetralogy kind of passes over the war. And so, as usual, though, this novel has an obsession with death, but there is a violent homoeroticism that manifests in this novel that Mishima doesn't really explore in his other ones. And there is no real proof outside of some letters that Mishima was gay, but I think those will suffice. And, you know, there is kind of debate in the community about that. But I think that this novel, especially written at a young age, really kind of explores that side of him, which is somewhat paradoxical. You know, later on in his life, he's this fascist, militaristic type figure who's trying to push that persona. But I don't think that those two are entirely separate. As we know, all throughout time, because men would have to go off to war for a long periods of time, men were gay or men were bisexual, whatever it was, and had relations with each other. It wasn't the end of the world. And now in our very macho and Christian culture, that's like looked down upon. Now because sexuality has entered politics and is stoked by politics, we have become obsessed with it. But, you know, in more previous times, some of these more hidden masks and these hidden activities were hidden. And Mishima is somewhat one of the last embodiments of this artistic, sentimental, but strong figure with this kind of other side of him. And so next we have Sun and Steel. And so a lot of people have read Sun and Steel, and I'm going to put Sun and Steel down here. It's, in terms of what it's competing against. So like I said, this is the canon, everybody. I would put this down here as a C because this is kind of a philosophical treatise. And I do enjoy the solar energy stuff, and I resonate a lot with this philosophy personally. And I think that in our age of nerds and deconstructor and destroyers and people who aren't doing anything, that this is all very important. But I feel like because I see the results and how people do it, that there is a missing component to this. So something that Mishima didn't get a chance to necessarily tap into because he was kind of traumatized from not being in the war was, one could call it higher consciousness, yoga, the East. In Mishima traveled extensively, and in the Temple of the Dawn, which we're going to be talking about in a couple minutes, he kind of writes about Buddhism a lot. Like there's probably at least 100 pages in that novel that are just directly about his the character Honda's experiences in India or with Buddhism and all of this stuff. And so Mishima was very well versed in this stuff, but I don't think he necessarily practiced it. I think that he took more of the classical Hagakure approach. So the Hagakure is a samurai manual that Mishima actually translated and wrote about. I don't know if that book is on here. That one's like A tier though. And that was kind of the backbone of his philosophy. And many people like the Wu-Tang Clan with their movie Ghost Dog kind of revived this, have this kind of martial arts, death first, samurai code mentality. But the problem is that honor killed the samurai, that approach is impractical and romanticized for today. I wish that we could return to some of these ideals. But if you want to actually be practical and make change in the world, if you actually want to dismantle hierarchy and bring back the strength of men or any of these things, then men need to evolve. We have this obsession, as I was just saying, with trad wives, with us trying to go back in time instead of saying, where did we go wrong? Because I feel like that honor culture and many of these things had a lot of stuff right, but life evolves. Change is the only thing that is permanent and always here. And so many of us don't contemplate, well, this was great and there were some great things here, and we got totally thrown off course by the industrial revolutions and colonization and digital technology and corporations and all this other stuff. But if we kept going in a positive arc, would we still all be acting like that with the advancements in technology and some of these things? And the answer is no, we would have changed. And so if we look back at the Hagakure and some of these principles and we say, well, when that was written, East hadn't even met West yet. We didn't even become a global world. What knowledge can we take or infuse into that system that we now know and that we now have access to? And one of the things, of course, is a softer side of mysticism and spirituality, which still has a martial arts component, and India really had that down. And the Arthurian romances, the knights errantry in the West had a lot of stuff figured out too. So we have the ability to combine East and West and then combine that with the modern world and everything we've learned through our emotional depth and being able to explore these internal worlds. And we can come up with a better, more refined version of masculinity. And so people who project backwards are just scared of actually living in this world, people who idolize it. And that's what Mishima was doing. And like I said, he didn't really have access yet. We didn't have the point. We didn't have enough information yet. And the type of person he was by the time it was maybe available was already too hardened. But that's why Sun and Steel is a little bit impractical, because I think that it can activate you. But what do you do with that activation? Are you here to heal the world or dominate the world? And do you want to just be a bro? A lot of guys that read this just want to be unemotional, detached bros that are dominating the world and doing whatever they want. And maybe they have morals and ethics and they aren't like screwing people over like, all the nerds are over in Silicon Valley. But in general, it's not a good look. I know those guys. And I'm not sitting here and saying that I'm better or like I've got everything figured out. But I see how those guys treat their friends, treat themselves, treat their wives, treat their pets. And I don't think that this red pill mindset is that positive. It's based a lot in truth, but half truths and polarization tactics which all the red pill stuff is, to stoke people up and draw them into a funnel, is usually a big trap and a big diversion from what we should be doing, which is educating and unifying the world. And that is going to happen through strength, which I think Sun and Steel can teach, but also through love. And so that's why it's down here in the C category. Like I said, if you are a new person and you've lived a passive life, I know a lot of young men who I talk to and who email me, 18 years old, raised in suburban environments, never really felt in power and never felt connected to anybody. And they read this and then they go out into the world and they feel empowered. And so that would be up there, for them. But I think in general, for most people and for the direction I think that society should be going, there are better kind of philosophical treatises or approaches to how we should be using our energy. And so next we have The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea, which is one of Mishima's most popular novels. And I'm going to throw this one down here in the B category because this novel explores two different characters mostly. We have Noboru, who is this young boy who is 13 years old, who likes to peek on his mom and has like a lot of problems because he doesn't have a dad. And then we have Ryuji, if I'm saying his name right, who is this sailor. And so this is somewhat of a commentary, and I have a whole video on this if you guys want to watch it. I think it's called like Mishima's Nietzschean novel. This is a commentary on like how Western philosophy and this Nietzschean will to power philosophy and these nihilistic tendencies were affecting post-World War Japanese youth. Because it's pretty crazy stuff if you think about it, that these boys, so this novel features this group of boys who are priding themselves on doing horrible things and detaching themselves. And Mishima was horrified by seeing this, by seeing the westernization of individuals, people seeking power and money and detaching themselves from traditional values. And even more importantly, virtue. These boys are not virtuous individuals. But on the other side, we have this Ryuji character who is a sailor, and he is this idealistic character, but he's also passive. He's also being sucked into this world. It's a beautiful blend of stuff. I think it's a little short, and I don't think I love the novel. I read it with my book club. I give it to a lot of my students. I think this is one of the better beginner ones that's not super easy, like The Sound of Waves or even Confessions of a Mask, but it doesn't have that like high level stuff going on like the Temple of the Golden Pavilion and Spring Snow. And so I'm going to throw it here at a B because there are some moments where your heart drops in this, like the mom and her, I won't spoil anything, her thoughts on the sailor at some point when it gets revealed. Like there's a lot here. And I should say that B category books, like if you go look at some of my other tier ranking lists, like those are some of the best books. Like I would be happy to read B tier books for the rest of my life. All right, moving forward, we have I should do these in order. We have Runaway Horses by Mishima, which is the second book in the Sea of Fertility tetralogy. And I am going to place this one up here in, I would say this is a high A. And so this one follows a character named Isao and Honda, who was a character in our first book. If I'm saying his name wrong, I'm sorry, I think it's Isao. And this novel is about idealism, purity, when it goes wrong. I would have to throw this one up here at an S tier, because Mishima takes risks in this novel. Like, for instance, there's like a section of this that's dozens of pages long called it's like a manifesto and this kind of historical document of something called the League of the Divine Wind. And so Mishima like threw some of these kind of asides, and funny, the League of the Divine Wind, I think Divine Wind is literally the word kamikaze in Japanese, which, was later used. But, through some of these asides, you really kind of dive into the philosophy of kind of the radical groups of the 1930s. So we think of, the Imperial Japanese Army and like the people that started World War II as the radicals. But when you look at their campaign into Manchuria and the people that were just kind of freewheeling over there, but even people in Japan who viewed that the Japanese government wasn't being pure enough, that they had been corrupted by Western influences, and that these people weren't necessarily mad with these wars, but were mad that the government was so inept and felt like they were taking power out of the emperor. There were multiple attempted coups in the 1930s and crazy groups that were around that were more extreme than, the group that was in power. We usually idolize like groups like the resistance, right? The people that are trying to stop us from going down this dark road. But they were like, Japan was trying to stop people from making it even wilder. And so this is like a really good example of that, because this is what kind of happens. So with Isao in this novel, we kind of see, because they're at this school, kind of these training grounds for what would become a lot of these soldiers in World War II. We see this radicalization project. And at some level, faith in the emperor and the government can only go so far, because there's always going to be talented students. There's always going to be people who go above and beyond the call, right, of what is asked for them and look deeper. And when they do, what happens? They're going to see the corruption and the corporations and the Western influences, and they're going to want to cut that away. And that's what this novel is about. It's about this idealistic group of young men who feel like they are on this divine mission. But coinciding with this, there is a general thread of reincarnation and all this crazy stuff involving that I won't spoil, that's also present in this novel, which is like really wild and eventually kind of comes to a head later on. And so Runaway Horses, for sure, you have to read Spring Snow first, but is an absolute masterpiece. I would put this low S tier, high A tier. I'm like a little bit back and forth on this one, but I have a soft spot for this. I have a soft spot for being an idealist. Like if you guys listen to me talk, like I just went on this rant about, us trying to become more pure and become this better version of ourselves. And, I lost friends who were idealistic, who literally died on this path of trying to pursue purity back in my early 20s. And, I almost did myself many of a time. And so I kind of have a soft spot for this book, but objectively, I think it's really good. I think it's one of the better pieces of Japanese literature, especially if you are open to the experience and what is going on. So we'll just finish the Sea of Tetralogy right now before we kind of get into some of the more lesser known works by Mishima, and books I haven't read in a couple of years, at least some of them, so my analysis won't be as good. So next we have The Temple of the Dawn, which is the third book in the Sea of Fertility Tetralogy. And I'm going to throw this down here at a C. This one's a little bit weird. I won't spoil anything, but this one's kind of a diversion. As I was saying earlier, there is at least 100 pages just talking about Buddhism and other things, which I'm not opposed to. I run a yoga channel named Yogadelics where I talk about yoga philosophy. So I could sit here and do this all day, but it just felt weird that Spring Snow and Runaway Horses and The Decay of the Angel have this kind of momentum and this pace. And this one is needed for a reason. So this one is going to help The Decay of the Angel score higher than it should, because it sets up a base. All this stuff about Buddhism and all this stuff actually affects The Decay of the Angel and how good it is. And if it wasn't there, and if Mishima wrote more about the characters, it wouldn't be as good in the fourth book. But I have to throw this one down here as a C, because if you just read this one as a standalone novel, or after the other two and you compared it to the best novels of all time, it is for sure down here in the C category. And so next we have The Decay of the Angel. And I'm going to throw this one up here at a high B. I think that Mishima needed some more time to finish this. He rushed the end, even though the ending is really good, like it's fire, because he left this manuscript before he went and, killed himself. And The Decay of the Angel and really The Temple of Dawn, have to do with obsession. They are an exploration of obsession. And I think Mishima was being very self-referential and knew that he was going through this. This is the conclusion of the tetralogy. There are characters in this that we've followed for decades, all the way from the first book. There are beautiful references and Easter eggs. There's some of the more beautiful writing about the sea in Japan that Mishima will ever do. There's just really a lot of depth here, and I would really like to spoil a lot, because to really explain this one in full and why it's good would require me. But Mishima basically, in the first three novels, and the first half of this novel, 3/4 of this novel, set all this stuff up, like prop all this stuff up, prop up all these ideas, and then reformats them, obliterates them, and does a ton of stuff to them in the last fourth of his last novel. And it's really beautiful to watch, like, because after having read, 1,500 pages and you are on this trajectory, and then he makes you rethink everything. It's like really good, because you have to rethink the entire series and what was going on, which is beautiful. And it like kind of speaks to this idea of obsession that I'm talking about. So next, so I highly, highly, highly recommend the Sea of Fertility tetralogy. And like I said, I have book club videos on most of these books. were all of these books. I forgot to upload some of them and they got lost, but I have book club call recordings over on the Substack if you want to follow along. And if you ever have questions, you can obviously email me over there if you're confused. Not a very confusing series though. So next on the list, we have Patriotism, which is a longer short story by Mishima. And I'm going to throw up here at a B. I think that this is a really good shift in Mishima's writing. So this is where Mishima turned into a more political writer. This is when he started to shift more toward right-wing politics. And this short story is a good example of some of his early thoughts on it, which is cool because later on, Mishima gets a little bit annoying with that stuff. He becomes a little bit, one could say, cliche or like too wrapped up in it all. Like, look, he like freaking killed himself. And so this is a nice blend. And this is what I like. I like when people kind of shift their perspective. And then at the start, there's a blending of the old world and the new world. And they're not totally locked down in a mentality. And it's done in an artistic way. And it's kind of a rare story where I feel like, the politics of it work even though they're at the forefront. And so, yeah, I'd recommend this one. This one's a short read. Like if you're not a novel reader or you don't have time maybe to read some of these or are unsure about Mishima or, like I said, going through a busy time in your life, you should check this out. Listen to it. There's free audiobooks on it online. I read this a while back and then I listened to it a couple months ago just when I was working, just because I liked it and wanted to just be in the Mishima mindset. And so, yeah, so next we have on the list The Sound of Waves. I'm going to put this down here at a B. I would say that this is Mishima's best love story. This is a more simple novel by Mishima, if I could say it like that. But interesting, it's been adapted for film 5 times. Like it's got a really good story. This is Mishima telling a story without a lot of the other crap. Like I said, all these other novels I've been talking about, Nietzschean ideals and the loss of Japan, and there is a lot of that in here, but this was an earlier novel for him, and I think really when he was still focused on like, I'm going to be a real storyteller. He was a real storyteller later on, but he just had more skills. This is him in the training grounds, but it's really interesting to kind of look at. So next on the list, we have Forbidden Colors. And I'm going to throw this one down here at a C. So this was written 2 years after Confessions of a Mask. And because Confessions was a success, I think that this one is a more extreme version. But I think, and I read this like these last 3 like years ago, so I'm a little bit less clear on these. But this one was not my favorite because there's a lot of like upper class stuff in this novel, a lot of cruelty with the characters, which Mishima does later with like in the Decay of the Angel, even the Temple of the Golden Pavilion and others. And it just doesn't land as well. It just seems a little bit more arrogant, even though I really like this one. Like I said, a C is not like I hate this. I would recommend this one, especially if you're interested in Mishima, but I would read everything else before you get down to here, unless you are like a really big fan. Like if you've read The Temple of the Golden Pavilion and Confessions of a Mask, and you're like, I love Confessions of a Mask and hate this other stuff, then Forbidden Colors is great because Mishima's prose explodes off the table. And I heard someone say that like, his early novels are great because he hadn't really heard of philosophy yet, that later on he got like lost in the sauce. And I agree that I really do believe in his power just as a prose writer without any of the philosophy with many of these earlier novels, The Sound of Waves, Confessions of a Mask. I think he's great. And I only could imagine like if he went in that direction and didn't become radicalized and went, wrote for 4 more decades, we might have seen some like real masterpieces, we already have masterpieces, but real like S tier stuff from him. So next we have The Thirst for Love, which I'm going to put even behind this. So this was actually written like very, very soon after. So Mishima was a prolific writer. He would just write. So The Thirst for Love was written kind of right after Confessions of a Mask. And I feel like Mishima fails in this one because of his point of view. For instance, he switches from like an omniscient point of view to like the narrator, to a character, and sometimes randomly shifts to other characters. And maybe it's the translation, but I really feel like it's not a very good execution here by Mishima. I remember reading it and thinking that this was actually really good and had some of the potential of Forbidden Colors and Confessions of a Mask, or The Sound of Waves in this early potential. The story was very strong. The depravity and many other things were strong, but I also feel, like I said, it just was kind of a failure. I could maybe I'll throw it down here as a D, honestly. I wouldn't really recommend this one to many people. I don't think that Mishima writes bad books. Like I said, he's so prolific, and I mean, I feel this is a high D, but like this is one of the worst ones I've read by him, and I would read this over many other novels coming out today. And so there you guys go. This is the Mishima final tier ranking of his books. I'm missing a couple of other, like on Haku, the samurai book I was mentioning earlier. That's like a B or an A. As you guys have probably seen in some of my other videos, I've covered a lot of his essays, and those compiled groups of essays are usually C to A tier. And yeah, expect a lot more Mishima content soon. I still need to make individual videos and do deep dives with spoilers into all of these. I would love to see you guys in the book club. Like I said, we're doing Confessions of a Mass this month. We'll probably do The Sound of Waves next month. And then we'll start hopping into things like Forbidden Colors and some of the more esoteric works, or maybe even hop into more nonfiction stuff. Who knows? So thank you guys for being here. I will see you guys very soon. And shout out to Mishima for producing so many great works that have transformed my life.